Welcome to episode 596 of the Barcelona podcast, brought to you by the Blue Wire Podcast Network. I'm Dan Hilton, and as promised, since we said goodbye to Xavi last week, today is Hello Hansi Flick, and in particular, hello to the tactical nuances of Hansi Flick. And since I said tactical nuances, I see the bat signal went out, hopefully over in the UK. I don't know if it gets international calls, but the bat signal went out in full effect, and the Purist, aka Jaleel, is here. He has answered the call as expected. So welcome back to the show, the Purist. As always, a pleasure to have you when we're talking new coaches, big ideas, and sweeping tactical nuances that we'll have to, I guess that's kind of a contradiction there, a sweeping and a nuance, but that's how you have to present these things. You have to make definite sweeping claims while also getting into the nuance. And again, that's why you're the right man for the job.
Yeah, it's what we love doing. So thanks for that, Dan. Good to be here. And yeah, excited to talk new era. Should be very exciting.
Well, you've already gotten into it a little bit yourself on your channel, on your YouTube channel, The Purist, of course. So you're already working, I see, on a full series of videos where we've only seen the first one about the tactics of Hansi Flick. So we're going to get into a lot of what you already covered in your first video and probably some of what you're going to be covering in the coming videos in your series. Because today I kind of want to break down our conversation in two different parts. There's the things that we believe Flick will bring to the job, and then there's how certain players you think might fit into that system if he does keep the same ideas, which you'd expect that managers generally from stop to stop don't radically change who they are or what their principles are. So I think where we begin is, we can expect there to be something similar between Hansi Flick and Xavi. And I think on your video, you summed it up wonderfully. Quantity over quality. So I'll just ask you right out of the gate, what do you mean exactly by quantity over quality and that being a similarity between Hansi Flick and Xavi?
Yeah, sure. So I would categorize both of these managers as, possession-based attacking football, as any top manager at a top club is going to be these days. But what ties them together, I think, is this idea that they both want to just generate chances in as high quantity as possible. Really, breaking lines quickly in order to get into the opposition third and create chances. Um, and that creates a kind of football where, you're doing a lot of, line breaking, essentially, getting from back to front with just one or two passes in order to generate a lot of activity around the opposition box. And that does stand in contrast to somebody like, for example, a Pep Guardiola or now a Xabi Alonso, who prefer the sort of, I would say, more patient approach in terms of they want the team to build as a team and progress the ball forward as a unit so that when you arrive in the opposition third, you're there as a team. Whereas with Xavi and with Flick, it's less about that. It's more about just getting the ball forward quickly when possible. And this is sort of nuance that I didn't add in that video that I probably should have done, is that wanting to get the ball forward quickly doesn't actually mean that you're always able to. And a big problem of Xavi's Barca towards the end of his tenure was that although the team didn't become inherently less vertical, they just struggled to generate space in order to be vertical very often. That typically was because the players at the base of the team, the defenders, the defensive midfielders, were not that great at generating space for themselves. So the ball got stuck in the first third a lot, and they were susceptible to heavy pressure and couldn't be as vertical as they wanted to. But I do maintain that the Xavi was still a very vertical oriented coach, and when the opportunities arose, they did get the ball from back to front quickly. And you can expect Flick, I think, to have the same sort of principle. At least he certainly did at Bayern.
Well, one of the words that popped up as well, and of what I've watched of Flick and what I remember from his Bayern Munich days and with the German national team, the word counterpress is really important. And when Xavi first took the job, that idea of the counterpress, and I use the term rest defense as well, especially with Busquets in tow. This has kind of been a conversation that I've been having throughout Xavi's tenure about once Busquets left, that rest defense for Barcelona completely fell apart. And again, I'll always say the definition rest defense, the way I'm using it is the setup that you have when you have the ball to prepare yourself to defend. And rest defense is most important when you lose the ball in the opponent's final third. And if you're properly set up to take that ball back, which again, the other term would be counterpress, as in you have to get the ball back once you've lost it and we gegenpress. But the different terminology that we use can kind of get abstract depending on the manager. And obviously, the word gegenpress with Klopp and all that stuff is because it's German, and Flick does follow this line of German coaches, so counterpressing is very important. But I would say that for Xavi, counterpressing was also really essential. And with Pedri being out, and with De Jong being out, and with Gabi being out for large portions of the season, they're just pivotal players that it felt like in the last year at least, and maybe a reason why Barcelona were better at the counter press last season. And even though the defense was lucky, they still won the Liga on the back of their ability to turn teams over and then make the most of those opportunities and luck in the team's final third of the field, which just didn't happen this year. And I think, again, I do attribute that largely to losing Busquets, not having an actual pivot, and then also losing those other midfielders who innately are really good at that. So, especially as I said, when Xavi went down, Xavi's team struggled, or Gabi, I should say, went down. Xavi's team struggled to counterpress. So, is there anything that you noticed about Flick that would say that his counterpress, and before you talk Gabi and individual players, I kind of want to just do the big, broad idea as a unit. Is there anything you notice about Flick that would say that he'll be more successful instituting a very successful counterpress?
I think there's two elements to a successful counter press. I would say there's the player profiles that you have. So, like you're just talking about Gabby and so on. That's obviously independent from the manager, and I attribute that quite largely to the success of your counter pressing, because a player like Gabby is going to massively improve over a player like Pedri, for example. However, there is a second element to the success, and I think that's more of a cultural thing. I did a video on Klopp a few months ago, and it was very clear that Klopp instilled a culture of hard work and of counter pressing into that Liverpool team, which is, you know, yes, you can be very vertical and very risky in your passing if you understand that that means you have to run more and you have to work harder for your teammates when you lose the ball and so on. And so everybody is really primed to counter press and run as soon as the ball is lost. And that is something that a coach can instill into a team, and there can be different levels of that sort of pressing culture or hard work culture, really, within a team. And certainly Bayern had that. So I think there probably were moments in Xavi's Barcelona where you think there wasn't really that immediate impetus to, snap and suddenly sprint and win the ball back when the ball is lost. You could argue that was something of a profile thing as well. For example, Flick's Germany were not as good as Flick's Bayern at counter pressing, and I think one of the main reasons for that was that Germany had Gundogan as an attacking midfielder. Often, this is more early Germany under Flick. Whereas Bayern had Muller, and Muller is a much more energetic, can cover much more ground than Gundogan. So there is still definitely a big profile part to it. However, you can't ignore the cultural aspect, and you would hope that Flick can instill a greater culture of hard work and intensity. But there is a limit to that, is essentially what I'm saying.
Well, yeah, talking about setup and build up and things like that, it seems like, and I really love the idea that you also kind of throw out. I wind up getting a little formulaic with, hey, we're seeing a 4-3-3, we're seeing a 4-4-2, and I think we're all kind of guilty of that at times when watching a game. And you count the players, and it is true that especially when you're seeing a more rigid defensive low block, like a 5-4-1, if you get out of that shape and get out of those numbers, then you open up spaces. But for a team that is expecting to have the ball, which again, the possession stats for Barcelona are really interesting because we always view them through the lens of this positional play, possession style team, and then the numbers don't necessarily bear fruit to that. And it also means that their results are up and down because of those things not bearing fruit. So it seems like we often see for Xavi a three at the back, two in the middle, two out wide, two and a half spaces, and a central figure up top. And as you mentioned in your video, Hansi Flick, a similar thing. And I'll say it again: in possession, it's three at the back, two in the middle, two out wide, and two and a half spaces with a central figure up top, which said is very similar between the two managers. But you also say that the way they arrive into that structure is the biggest difference that separates them, though. So even though on paper you might take a snapshot or a still image and it looks the same, how they arrive to that is very different. So how are you optimistic about those differences?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, Xavi Xavi's system was very rigid. That is to say, uh, certainly in that last season, that the system you saw on in that still image, those players were inhabiting their starting positions essentially. So when you were playing three centre backs, they were three centre backs, and when you had two pivots, they were two pivots. Whereas with Flick's, the way that Flick arrived at that was more through um, players drifting into new positions. So, for example, a three at the back might be created by two centre backs, but then one of the pivots dropping in, either Kimmich or Thiago. Um, and that shape then wouldn't be consistent throughout the entire game. With a Xavi Barcelona, you can basically stop, you can take a still image at any point and you would see that initial shape because players were just inhabiting their original positions. Whereas with Flick, there is much more movement around positions, new structures being created. And obviously, to do that, you need intelligent footballers. You need quality footballers that are able to manage the uncertainty of those different shapes that you're creating and understand how the ball can be moved around from there. But if you're using better players, I do generally maintain that it's more beneficial to have a bit more positional freedom in the way that Flick should give Barcelona, especially when we're talking about the quality players like Pedri, like De Jong, like Gavi, and so on. So as long as those players are fit, which probably was the biggest downfall of Xavi's Barcelona, I actually think that the Flick impetus of slightly more positional freedom and not being locked into this structure, but actually being able to find solutions on your own, will probably maximize their abilities and give Barca greater control of the games than they did in that sort of more rigid system.
Yeah, well, you talk about personnel, and I'm glad you brought up De Jong because I think there's the two positions that under Xavi's Barcelona, but also under Flick's Barcelona. I think I raise flags and concerns, and structurally, I don't know how it's going to work when we talk about, we'll say, the defensive midfielder. That's a term I'm going to use because I'm going to get a little nuance in a second. And then there's a left winger, which I feel like will come up at a later time. But I think in both these systems, just having more quality in the left wing position, and I'm kind of, this is a little aside here, but I kind of want you to just agree with me or validate me, and if not, disagree. But I feel like with a left wing situation for Barcelona, they just need to add quality there, and the function of a left winger in both the Xavi system and in Hansi Flick's system, especially in the half spaces. I think you see the Rafinha or the best version of Rafinha on the left wing in that half space, and you could see him doing a very similar job and succeeding in that same position under Flick. And then the other left winger, if there is one at all, would just have to have more quality under Flick than that position would have brought you under Xavi. So before we move to the pivot and the double pivot and the midfield stuff, yeah, you could throw in your 2 cents on the left wing if you have something to add.
Yeah, I do agree generally, but I also think that it will be beneficial for Barcelona to add a higher quality one versus one player on the
Mm-hmm.
left wing position as well, because there is going to be somebody holding the width on that side. Same as there was in Xavi's system, the same will be true in Flick's system. But against some teams, you're going to want that player to be pretty good at taking players on. I think that offers a massive benefit. So, while probably the default will be Balde next season, and it was before he got injured for Xavi, if a team sits particularly deep and it's hard to generate spaces, it's a really nice option just to have that one versus one winger who can do it instead. So, Girona, Savio is an excellent example.
Mm-hmm.
If anybody watched the FA Cup final between City and United, um, City brought on Doku in the left wing in the second half because United were just sitting deep, and it completely changed the game because they could just pass the ball to him and he would attack Wan-Bissaka. And so having that option, I think, regardless of whether it's the main option or not, is really useful for different situations during the season. And Barca don't have a 1v1 winger on the left, so I would definitely add that to the squad.
Yeah, and this is not a defense of Barcelona. You'd expect that they were a team that would have one of those, but when you look around world football in general, I mean, how many of those left wingers that you really can trust to consistently take on the opposition can you give the ball to? Is there 10, 12 of them? And I mean, you already named two of them, and then Vinny Jr., of course, another one of them. And I think that list really dries up quickly. Nico Williams, of course, that's been linked to Barcelona. So I think that list dries up pretty quickly, especially at the price point as well, which makes it really difficult. And I would argue then that even a more essential problem to figure out, especially if you're Barca and Hansi Flick, and Xavi never really solved it once Busquets left, that pivot or double pivot debate. And it does bring up a question I often ask with Xavi. Since Xavi had no natural pivot and Frankie de Jong's contract meant that he wasn't going anywhere, and his contract still means that I don't think he's going anywhere, is there a way forward that suits Flick's ideas without a ball playing pivot to complement de Jong? Because the squad doesn't have one, as I said, and I did have a little chuckle today seeing Mikel Moreno so heavily linked with the club because he's a really, really good player, and the stats bear fruit that he's just an impact guy. He's been one of the best. He's been one of the best midfielders, arguably with Toni Kroos as team of the team of the season in the Liga players. That consistently his level is very high, and there is very little variance even in the good performances he gives you. He generally always gives you a 6.5 or 7 out of 10 performance every single match. Sometimes he gives you a 9 or a 10, and yeah, occasionally the 5, but his level is always very consistent. But for being such a really, really good player, you know, it just seems to me when you talk about Pedri, and I'm going to do the Pedri Gundogan thing in a second, but I'm just saying all the midfielders and naming them in De Jong, in Gundogan, in Pedri, and then if we call Christensen a defensive midfielder this year, who knows? But adding Moreno to that mix, it feels to me that he's completely redundant to what Barca already has and does not fill the need. But you also see why he's linked and why Kimmich was linked at the moment, just because, again, a guy like Zubamendi, who's a natural pivot, his price tag and release clause and his willingness to stay at Real Sociedad is much higher than Kimmich's staying at Bayern Munich and the contract and the money it would cost to get him. And then Moreno's contract ends in 2025. And once you read that, you're like, okay, now I understand why Barcelona's linked to him more than a natural pivot might be, because as I've been saying now for 2 or 3 years, you keep turning these rocks over, but unless Barca have 120 million to spend on a pivot that is a surefire thing, they're going to have to take a 60 or 70 million euro risk on a player that might necessarily fit. So I say all of that, all of that little aside and thing about the Moreno thing to ask that same question again to you is that, is there a way forward that suits Flick's ideas without ball playing pivot to complement De Jong? Or, could Barcelona continue, regardless of the systems and the changes and the freedom, just look very similar and, we'll say, without an ability to really truly control matches? Because I think that was the biggest issue under Xavi's Barcelona. They just could not have a modicum of control for any amount of sustained time.
Um, I actually think this is where Flick's Bayern model looks really promising because there was no single pivot in that system. I mean, Xavi, I wrote a thread on Twitter recently about Xavi's time at Barcelona, and for me, the biggest impact, the reason for the downfall was the loss of Busquets, just because of how central that sort of problem-solving, press-resistant guy is if you're trying to play very vertical, very spaced-out football. Because they're so isolated all the time, and you need to have such incredible technical quality to turn those deep possessions into, switches of play into space or line breaking passes or whatever. Um, what most teams do in the absence of an elite single pivot is just compromise by playing two guys in that position, essentially, and that's the compromise that Xavi had to make when he moved to a double pivot of De Jong plus whoever, Gundogan or Christensen or whoever. Now, I actually think that the most, and this is a bit of a spoiler for my upcoming videos, but whatever. Um, I think the most controlling and technical and uh, efficient double pivot for Barcelona is probably De Jong and Pedri. I really think that Pedri is much better suited to a deeper role if you're playing vertical football, because most of the ball playing happens at the base. Because as soon as you've generated space, the forwards don't get a lot of time to think. They're just attacking space quickly and putting balls into the box and whatever. So the control and the pausa, that all comes from the deep line playmakers, and that was absolutely the case in Flick's Bayern with Thiago and Kimmich, or Kimmich and Goretzka. Goretzka was used more as a sort of box crash and whatever, but at their best, it was Thiago and Kimmich. And Barca's closest thing to that is Pedri de Jong, because they're just sensational ball players, both of them. And they give you that positional intelligence, the ability to, move outside of the structure and to create solutions for themselves. So good under pressure, so good at breaking lines with different kinds of passes. And the biggest reason that they didn't play in a double pivot together was one, injuries, but also I think Xavi, for whatever reason, trusted Gundogan more in that deep role. I think that was a big mistake for me. I think Pedri de Jong, it couldn't have happened that often anyway, purely because of the injuries, but those two give you an extremely well balanced double pivot. Caveat in possession. Um, so the only reason for me to sign an additional midfielder is when a pairing of those two and the balance that they give you, uh, you're playing a team in which you need more ball winning. Essentially, you need more discipline and you need more breaking up of play, and that's only going to be against top four in the league, possibly even just Real Madrid, and then Champions League games, and that's why a signing like Marino, I understand more than Kimmich because I think Marino's a better ball winner than Kimmich. He's slightly more balanced. Um, I really don't think Kimmich offers anything that uh, Pedri, De Jong, Gundogan, Gavi offer in that deep role. I think there's actually a decent argument about Kimmich at right back, but anyway, in terms of signing a defensive midfielder, I think the only thing that you need to add, assuming that those players stay fit all season, is a disciplined defense first, but still quality ball player midfielder that can play alongside either De Jong or Pedri in games in which you need that. So I do think that Barca actually, with the assuming we have the sort of Bayern Flick model of this fluid double pivot controlling the game, has most of the ingredients needed for that to work already. And then there's just a little bit of extra muscle that you might want to add for the top Champions League games and so on. That was a bit rambly. I hope I answered the question though.
No, you certainly did. And I tend to really agree with you on the Young and Pedri point. And I think that is what the whiplash of being a Barcelona fan or trying to follow this team from match to match can do to you. Because, you know, even under Xavi's Barcelona, you'd go look at the unbeaten streak. That was at 13 games this season where they figured some things out, things were looking good, and then one injury or one match against a top team or the red card against PSG, and the entire narrative is flipped on its head. The entire success of a team, the entire idea of is the model working or is it fundamentally flawed, then that's all brought to a head. And as you mentioned, against the top four teams and the occasional big Champions League match. And I say big as in the one against the other team that might win the group or for Barcelona 2 years before. You get it. The ones that help you move on in the group or the knockout season and things like that. And, it's interesting because not only do I agree with you about the De Jong and Pedri point and where Pedri is best, and I've been saying about that with him and my concerns about him in the final third and his fitness and the way he's asked to press, even though he seems, especially without Gabi, that he runs his tail off behind Lewandowski, but you could see that he was just stretched too thin in a lot of parts of the season, coming back from the latest injury. And I know it looks and on paper we feel like Pedri should be that player who's farthest forward in the midfield, but to your point, like everything that we've learned about Pedri and everything that seems to actually suit him at its best has him deeper with De Jong. And it's interesting because the reports this week, I don't know how much you can believe them, but the reports that Flick may like Pedri as the farthest midfielder forward, which again is really interesting and counter to what not only we believe, but what you'd expect from Flick. Because considering Gundogan played under Flick with the German national team, and Gundogan might have actually been the team's MVP this past season, they were, that being Barcelona, certainly better once Christensen was inserted as a defensive midfielder and Gundogan was set up higher up the field, especially while De Jong and Pedri were injured. So you didn't really have to have that conversation at all. Gabi also out. So, that report is very interesting to me because, would it surprise you if we saw Flick have Pedri as the farthest forward? And then if that's the case, what does he even do with Gundogan? Is it that Gundogan at this point, I can't imagine a player who is arguably, again, the most consistent and the healthiest midfielder and the one who is always on the field where he needed to be and leading the team in chances. he will be 34 in October, but it seems to me that this coming season is not the one where you begin to kind of phase him out of any larger role. I think he, if anything, might have a more outsized role under Hansi Flick this season.
Yeah, I think that role. I mean, it would be really disappointing for me, to be honest, to prioritize Pedri in that role over Gundogan, mainly because of how good Gundogan is there. Like, let let alone maximizing Pedri's ability. Gundogan is an incredible creative player in those pockets, and I think the only reason that a Hansi Flick would want to phase him out, or look for other options, not even necessarily phase him out, is to add more intensity, more pressing intensity, and sort of like I said with the Muller Gundogan thing for Germany, Germany's uh, style of play had to change quite significantly without Muller because he was so intense and could cover so much ground and counter press just immediately. And so if Flick wanted to implement that kind of aggressive 10, which I think you actually really have to if you're going to be playing the intensive counter pressing and pressing football that he's going to look to do, then the options are not Pedri, but one Gavi and two Firmine. And those two players, I mean, there's actually a really interesting conversation about Gavi as a 10, but um, Firmine is a pretty obvious replacement for Gundogan in that role,
Mm.
just because similar levels of comfort between the lines. You've also got the output in terms of the goal scoring, but that you also have the intensity and the ability to cover ground. And I think that is the if Flick is to go in a different direction from Gundogan being prominent there, you have to go the more energetic route than Pedri. I think that just doesn't really make much sense to me at all, personally.
Well, I appreciate you calling me out on that because I think this season I got into the habit throughout the first half of the season of listing off those midfielders, mentioning the ones that were injured. And while mentally I started to add Christensen to that mix, you're right, because Fermin Lopez, he plays so high. And in my brain, I he's a forward, but he's also a midfielder. And so he winds up when I list out the midfielders and the forwards and I think about next year's squad, I seem to either put him at the bottom of that depth chart for the midfielders when I'm trying to build a starting 11, or I put him on the bottom of the depth chart on the forwards when trying to build that starting 11. And yet, he was second on the team in goals. And it's like that cannot be underestimated, that cannot be denied. And he just got better and better. And who knows, like where Flick, and you mentioned that pressing, like to me, for Fermin Lopez, if he becomes more disciplined in his pressing in those permutations, you could tell his timing was off sometimes. But if he really takes like a fish to water with the counter press of Flick, I mean, Fermin Lopez is excellent. And I think that's going to allow Barcelona to have more difficult conversations, which is exciting to me because if everybody does stay healthy, which we also said, these are a lot of ifs here. And with Gabi coming back from an ACL, with Pedri already being Pedri, and you never know who's going to go down. I just mentioned Gundogan turns 34 in October, and as my little complaint aside that I always give, my club season is starting. Usually, my knees don't start to hurt until the end of August, and my knees are already starting to hurt, and it's only June, which tells me that I've got a birthday in a week, and I'm just getting older. And as Gundogan has showed that similar age is definitely a path that is well trod into players that already begin to see, well, I just don't, it's not that you don't have it anymore. It's that you don't consistently have it as expected. So I don't think that Gundogan could possibly play the minutes that he did this season. So it'd be fun to not have any argument or debate about who starts or whatever, because you could get into, yes, Champions League final, that's what we're talking about. But even Real Madrid, they just, I can't believe I'm doing this, but yes, Real Madrid won the Champions League final without Chouamani, because even though at so many parts of the season I'd say, oh, well, Chouamani, if he's not on the field as that ball winning midfielder, you have to have him there. You have a problem without him, but Real Madrid just had the depth to say, okay, no, this is who we're starting. We trust this situation. And they were healthy enough in the midfield and had the depth to do that. And I think if Barcelona had that same quote unquote problem, then throughout a course of a season, one guy goes down and you're totally okay with, being able to replace him fully in a similar role. And speaking of that physical stuff, I've transitioned myself well here because Laporta yesterday on Barca One talked about wanting more physical preparation from the team and not liking that the team dropped its level in the 60th minute onward twice against Real Madrid. And I feel like every offseason, regardless of the manager, we talk about the physical preparedness of Barcelona needing to be better in the first team. And going back to the days of Segura as the general manager, when there was a belief that they were not re-signing La Masia players who were not necessarily as physically fit. And I remember the story back when I think he was 15 at the time, a 15-year-old Fermin Lopez. It was like the final hour when he signed that contract turning 16, and that first quote unquote, professional contract turning 16. And there was a belief that he'd be one of the ones who was slashed because of the ideas that were being put forth. And I will also say, before someone corrects me, I understand that I think Pep Segura was gone by the time Fermin Lopez was 16. So I'm just doing my math, but it's 4 or 5 years, and he was gone 7 years ago. So you get the point. But some of those things about La Masia, then again, chopping the players that physically they might not think are totally there. I think there's a real irony in that conversation as well, because the kids who are coming up in the academy look to be physically prepared. Even if they look like children, Lamine Yamal clearly was physically prepared, to the point where he played way too many minutes for what I would ever want a 16-year-old to play. But there was a physical preparedness to him. And same with Pau Barcy. When he was asked to play more minutes at the first team level, he wound up being physically up to the challenge. And I think staying healthy and that physical preparedness is a bit different than, those Instagram posts or the pictures we see of all the muscles on all these players, right? Like, at what point my people can go on the, and ask and leave in the comments your guess as to what date we're going to see that photo of Pedri and his massive muscular thighs and the proper lighting and the huge biceps, and everyone's saying, oh, look at Pedri under Flick. He's going to be healthy all season long, right? Because that propaganda is coming. It's just a matter of when and how many weeks under Flick are we going to see those things. So yeah, I think the physical preparedness conversation is really interesting, but I do wonder how Laporta expects Flick to kind of change that, because I feel like a lot of luck is involved in that more than anything else.
Yeah, a lot of luck is involved, and it's so multifaceted that it's really difficult to just say, bring this guy in and everybody's going to be fine, and everyone's going to be, sprinting up until the 90th minute. It's nuanced in terms of the coaching staff. It's nuanced in terms of the individual players. It's nuanced in terms of how you play football. I mean, I was just saying earlier that the sort of level of verticality that you play, the amount of direct forward passes you play, means the more that you're going to have to run. And so, there's so many decisions that are going to go into physical conditioning and competitiveness, that it's you said the word, it's propaganda. Essentially, there's a new manager come in, and it's propaganda to say, like, he's going to fix these problems, and he might install better physical conditioning. I have no idea what the dietary regimes were going on at Barcelona. Maybe they'll be improved. Maybe they'll be spending more time in the gym. I don't know, but it's something that's basically impossible for us to analyze. And even when it goes wrong, even when injuries happen, very, very few of us are in the know enough and have the technical and scientific understanding of biology to tell us why that's happened. So obviously, if the team can be in better physical condition, that's obviously a net benefit. There's no drawback to that whatsoever. So we'll all be hoping that that is the case. But I think just be careful about, like you said, this sort of propaganda that everyone's going to be lifting weights and going to turn into Adama Traore's by the end of preseason.
Well, yeah, because I think we saw under Klopp's Liverpool, where the idea is that German managers equal better fitness and a better ability to counter press and go with some of those, what have become these, again, broad, sweeping German tactical approaches, even though Thomas Tuchel is also German, and people seem to forget that because of the different approaches that he
Yeah.
takes. But those managers that fit a certain idea of what German thinking and ideology football is supposed to look like. So I think it is a necessity, yes, but to your point as well, we have no idea, and every player is different, and some players might take to it a little bit better than others. If Flick is going to change the way that practices are run, which he will, obviously, he might change
Yeah.
a few things, but football is also football. There's only so many things you could do with the human body, and over all these different years, I think it's been 120 years that footballing they're starting to figure out what to do, and occasionally somebody adds something new, or some new drill or something like that works out really well, or a new marker like the beep test to figure out who's fit and who did the offseason work and all that stuff. But yeah, I think Flick is already underway. Having, if there's one thing he's going to institute already, it's, hey, how I want you to take your vacations and kind of be prepared to return in a few weeks. I mean, and I say that, but the players are currently playing in the Copa America or the Euros, and they're, to me, there's just too much football, and you can't do anything about that for your club teams, no matter what you want to do. So, speaking of players who are out injured, who have been injured, I'm going to ask you, who do you think will thrive under Flick? And why is the top answer on the board Gabi when he gets fit again? I don't need you to answer that, but my answer is Gabi. So I'm kind of taking that one because I think he's the immediate and instant answer if he's able to come back fit. So I'm going to take him off the table because of just how obvious Gabi under Flick seems like a match made in heaven. But who else do you think would be top of your list as saying, okay, they were good under Xavi, or they were even great under Xavi, like Gundogan, but I think they're going to be even better under Flick?
I would say there's a couple. I'd say Alejandro Balde could be very, very important, and his role in sort of uh, a mimicry, or his own version of the Alphonso Davies role at Bayern is kind of looks absolutely perfect in terms of not only is he gonna be incredibly important for stopping transitions and just doing all the sprinting up and down, but also in the attacking output sense. Davies wasn't really, he was at times, but wasn't really playing as a sort of hug the touchline left winger. It was more of like a arrive in space kind of guy, like an Andy Robertson maybe at Liverpool. And I think Balde, that will suit him massively. And since there's absolutely no other reasonable choice at left back in a Flick system, I don't think. I think Balde will really thrive. And the other, I would say, is actually Rafinha. I think what the transformation that Rafinha went on under Xavi will kind of be taken to its next logical step under Flick, as in, he gets that kind of more central, more less rigid role of just being stuck to the touchline, and I imagine will be able to express himself a lot more, especially if there's going to be a bit more positional freedom around him as well. And this idea of just the forwards being these like uber fast-paced, all action, like you create a chance at every single opportunity you get, like that just fits Rafinha's mentality perfectly. It's just what he wants to do. He picks up the ball, he wants to make something happen. He wants to play a through ball, or he wants to shoot or whatever. So I think that would be really a really nice role for him, and he's also going to fit, I think, very well on the defensive side of things, um, as a intense presser and a really hard worker. So I think those two guys could be have really prominent roles this season. I also think one sort of rogue shout is Hector Fort at right back. I feel like could have a bit of a breakthrough. Um, I don't think Koundé super suits a Flick right back if he's going to play a similar system to Bayern. I think you need more creative impetus, and Cancelo would be absolutely sensational on the ball, but obviously he's got big issues off. So I think Fort kind of is a nice mid ground between those two players in terms of it's going to work really hard, it's going to be competent on the ball, can defend decently, but also has a bit of a creative streak in him in the final third, is able to produce, moments of quality. In a balanced role, sort of similar to what Pavard did for Bayern under Flick. So I could be miles off with that one, but just thinking of, fullback solutions, I think that could be an interesting one. But yeah, I'd say those three players potentially.
I find it really funny because I feel like you must have been looking at my list here of my questions and the players I wanted to bring up, because I have 4 or 5 questions for you, and the next one involves Cancelo and Balde. So I feel like you and I are very much on the same wavelength in terms of who we're trying to be checking out and looking at and things like that. So you already mentioned them, and I do want to talk some of the pieces of this puzzle. As also being reported today by Fabrizio Romano, no less, was that Jorge Mendes, who I guess Shadow runs Barcelona, right? Have we all agreed to that? We're on the same page. But Barcelona are both, and Mendes are both looking to bring back both João Felix and João Cancelo. Something it sounds like a lot of Kool-Aids are very much against, regardless of who the manager is. And I feel like João Felix is the antithesis, not only a bad fit, but the antithesis of a player that would thrive under Hansi Flick. Am I wrong about that gut feeling?
Uh, Definitely as far as the out of possession side of football goes, which is a pretty significant side of the game. Um, I actually think as an attacking player who likes to drift into pockets, I mean, you know, I do have a bit of a bias when it comes to João Felix because I like the idea of João Felix.
Everyone does. Everyone
Yeah.
does. He was 120 million to Atletico Madrid to Benfica because he was one of the best young players in world football, and he also has shown us. I mean, did he have? Has anyone ever had a better what are they called, like goal of the week or goal of the month candidates per minutes that they played this season, per 90, right? Has anyone ever been more impressive in the minutes that they played when they scored their goals, and then when they on the all the meta minutes were just so disastrous that he was relegated to the bench? Because to your point, not only was Rafinha better under Xavi, but I think Rafinha, I agree with you completely. If we see the next evolution of Rafinha, then João Felix is nothing more than a bit player for this team then, especially if they
Yeah.
bring in a left winger. But sorry, go on with that.
No, no, exactly, exactly. And that is why I'm sort of biased because I like players that can produce moments like that. And
Mhm.
it's actually quite rare in modern football that you see a player just express themselves and execute the kind of things that he's able to execute. But it's been so inconsistent and frustrating that it's not tenable. However, there is an argument that in a Flick team like his Bayern team, consistency isn't actually that important. It's more about in terms of the forwards. It's more about just pure uh, well, it's hard to say output without referencing consistency, but the moments are what define it because again, it's quantity over quality. So you're producing so many opportunities in attacking third. It doesn't matter if you lose the ball all the time, like a Pep would get frustrated. It's part of the game plan to lose the ball because you're being direct. And so just having that moment of quality is sometimes enough. But certainly it has been too inconsistent. His overall game has been too inconsistent and absolutely off the ball. He just does not have the mentality, the impetus to work super hard. He gets frustrated really easily. You can see him, if he doesn't receive a pass, he just drops his head and it kind of becomes a cycle where he doesn't want to work hard because he's annoyed. And then, that element of João Felix is just super frustrating and absolutely, I agree with you, would be the antithesis of the kind of culture that Flick would want to create. So yeah, that's completely fair. I think if other options like Xavi Simmons or whatever are possible, then
Mhm.
you'd probably take them in a heartbeat.
Yeah, that does worry me. The report today about João Felix kind of probably indicates that that Xavi Simmons for some reason isn't going to be available. Because if you have to pick between Xavi Simmons and João Felix, I'm choosing for this Barcelona under Hansi Flick, especially. I'm choosing Xavi Simmons 10 out of 10 times. I'm not even thinking twice about it because yeah, João Felix has those moments of brilliance, but Xavi Simmons has 7 of those 10 moments of brilliance that João Felix has, but also in all the other moments. To your point, the body language, the work off the ball. I mean, look what he did for that press for PSV. And of course, yes, the back lines in Netherlands and the Eredivisie are a little different, but he replicated that form and that hard work and all of those intangibles, that positional understanding. He replicated that at RB Leipzig this last year. So I'm really impressed with Xavi Simmons, and I would pick him in a heartbeat. But my concerns is that in the last week, those that buzz has kind of died down, and because it is alone, you'd feel like that would have already happened. But then you also say, well, players are leaving for the international break, and you never know. So, again, transitioning into players kind of in flux. Three names that are really interesting to me here under Hansi Flick would be Vitor Roque, Ferran Torres, and Ansu Fati. And I think a lot goes into whether or not a player makes sense for a manager. And I feel like with those three, it really is about the boring stuff. I know we don't want to say that, but contracts, amortization, wages, as in, is Ferran Torres, more valuable than other players? Because as in Rafinha to be sold, or again, Zao Felix was on loan. So not having him or keeping him for as low a cost as possible and just like a loan, deal might be better than what you can get on Ferran Torres, who is again nearing the end of that amortization on that contract. So you might be able to get something more for him that helps you out. And then Vitor Roque, again, if you sell him for 5 million, then what you would even bought him for, then you're immediately recouing or are making some on a player that managers just in general might not trust yet at Barcelona for the next few seasons. And if his camp wants him to be sold instead of going out on loan, then that's already decided for you. If that's really what they push for, and Barcelona going to make the most of it. And then, of course, Ansu Fati, we've done this a million times, but that's still the name that, even though he's not who he could have been 3 years ago, he still has a lot of quality. And when you talk about, and he's so interesting because this conversation began with quality over quantity. But when I look at Ansu Fati and his ceiling, I see a player that is actually quality over quantity, that his moments of brilliance excite me even more than João Felix. And maybe it has to do with age and stuff, but you can tell that Ansu just wants it in a different way than João Felix does, even though I think João Felix's ceiling is still higher than Ansu's because of all those injuries. But of those players I named, Vitor Roque, Ferran Torres, Ansu Fati, do any of those names, I guess just talking about the tactical approach, I'm giving you kind of the out here. From a tactical approach, do any of those players really jump off the page to you and make a lot of sense under Flick and you think could thrive? Or do you think those are three names that are immediately on the chopping block because of all the things that I just laid out?
I think probably the most obvious keep is now Vitor Roque because, in absence of another option, that is because, um, so much of Flick's Bayern was about the intensity and the pressing, and Lewandowski had to do that, and he not just press intensely, but also do a lot of running over the top and everything like that. So it's basically impossible to implement that football unless your centre forward is working as hard as everyone else. And if he's not going to, then you need alternatives. And I would imagine with the money spent on Vitor Roque, he's the guy that you're going to try and trust to do that. Um, it seems that he has that intensity, he has that hard working. So that sort of seems like a reasonable bet. I didn't really understand why he was going to be sent on loan, to be honest, but um, yeah, I mean, we haven't seen that much of him, so there could be a technical, footballing issue, but it's hard to say. So purely in terms of having a centre forward that can do that hard work, it seems like he'd be a pretty decent option. Um, Varane, I think, is always just a good squad player to have from a tactical perspective. I think I do like Ferran Torres as an intelligent footballer. I think you can put him in basically any system, and he's going to find a way to carve out a niche for himself because he's just smart. He understands movement. He understands movement in response to teammates, and I don't think he would ever be for me a nailed on starter for Barcelona. But in his peak in the Xavi era, he was part of what I would consider the best version of that team.
Mhm.
So I think there is an argument to keep him around, but that does depend on the signings that you make because Barca are really light in terms of forwards. If you're going to start Yamal and Rafinha, there's basically and assuming that João Felix is either gone or just relegated to obscurity. Um, you really there's not a lot else going on that players that can occupy those wide areas and make an impact. And Ferran Torres can make an impact. So if there's no other option, then I think Ferran Torres is a good squad player. But if there's decent enough investment, then you can definitely talk about trying to maximize his value on the market. And Ansu Fati, man, it's such a difficult one because last season at Brighton, he was just poor. He was
Mm-hmm.
just not he was just not effective at all, and confidence so low. Now, a De Zerbi system and a Flick system are very different, but it's the basic things. It's the things we are talking about with Joao Felix. It's the first touch and it's the confidence of being consistent in just simple passes and it's hard to justify on a semi-consistent basis moments that win games. And I just don't know how you prove your ability to do that. In a team that is going to be competitive and has no room to just try players out, and it's really hard one because obviously we all want Ansu Fati to succeed, and he has that. He has something in him. Um, but who knows? It could just click. It might be a case of circumstance where he has to stick around because of a lack of other options, and then he plays and he scores a worldie, and then his confidence is up, and he scores a few more worldies, and it all comes into place. But it seems like an unlikely scenario for me. Um, I hope to be proven wrong. I really do.
Yeah, it's like it's this hard reality about Ansu that it feels now at this. I mean, just looking at the timeline, he's technically been like lost or gone longer than he was there, and that's not to say of what the injuries do to a player and what they have done to him. And we really have yet to see that post-injury Ansu playing with confidence and making a difference in any team that he's been in. And yeah, everyone and their mother wants the best for that kid. And Levon had a really great point last week that maybe one of the worst things that maybe the worst thing that Xavi did was kind of putting that one game when he played him in the extra time and maybe pushed him a little bit too hard. I mean, and obviously the kid wanted it too. So you don't know what was Xavi pushing, maybe the medics, and Xavi said, all right, this is actually what we want from you. And he gave a bit too much, or who knows how that all worked out. And you tell the kid like clearly wants it. And again, whether it's Barca or anywhere else, I just want the best for Ansu Fati. Seems like a great kid, good head on his shoulders, good family around him, and it just hasn't worked out. So, speaking of La Masia players, let's end with a pretty simple one. Maybe a little swap here of La Masia players. I know you haven't watched a ton of him with Barca Athletic. You've been watching a lot of other football like Bayer Leverkusen, which is a little higher level than Barca Athletic. But do you have a strong opinion about potentially letting Sergio Roberto, the first captain, go and then replacing him in the squad with Mark Casado? Because I felt like there were some movement and legs to those reports that Roberto, he was going to resign with Xavi when he was staying. And then once he found out Xavi was not staying around, Hansi Flick had no personal connection to him and was like, well, I mean, that's a player they don't necessarily need. And Mark Casado, on the field at least, might be able to do 85 to 90% of what Sergio Roberto can do. And he also has the potential of doing even more than that in the future, where Sergio Roberto, I think what you see from him in his best days are the best days that he could give you.
I think the only reason to consider keeping Sergio Roberto around is an experience thing more than it is an actual
Mm-hmm.
quality thing. We've talked for a while about how young the squad is generally. There's a lack of leaders on the pitch, and certainly a lack of leaders that come from that sort of Spanish Catalan core. So um, that is the argument to keep him around. I don't think he gets anywhere near any starting 11, or that he's for the last couple of seasons he's been a last resort, and the fact that he's had to play in the biggest games of the season is just completely unfortunate. But as a somebody that's actually contributing to a squad in a season, he doesn't really contribute for me. So unless you're keeping him around for leadership abilities, then I just don't see it necessary. But there is definitely the argument that you need to fill the squad with leaders, regardless of whether they're playing or not. So that's a call that Flick definitely has to make, because you can't underestimate that. I think it's something that people don't really think about, but actually can have a big impact.
Yeah, 100%. Because there again reports that Flick, his Spanish, he's been learning it, but it may not be perfect. So how he navigates the word entorno, it only comes up when we remember it, but it's an important part of it. And I think you're looking at Pau Barsi and Hector Fort and Lamine Yamal and Fermin Lopez and all the young players, even Gabi coming back from his injury. The Catalan entorno and the buzz around that, we don't know. We don't know if these young kids have an infrastructure or even support each other. And I like seeing how they're all commenting on each other's Instagram posts. They seem like a really tight knit, really good group. Again, all between the ages of 15 and like 21 right now at the in the team. Balde as a part of that too. And so seems like they're all kind of leaning on each other and helping each other, but also having that older player when things go bad and saying, hey, you're 16, but you're going to be getting some heat in this Catalan press that you've never seen before, you've never understood before. And if he's necessary to do that, maybe. But again, like if Ter Stegen, who's been in Barcelona now for 10 years, and so you expect that he as a leader understands the language, understands the world, understands the entorno. Same thing with Araujo, who's had his ups and downs. And you'd expect that those middle ground players, I mean, De Jong, when I talk about criticism, those are players that kind of understand how to navigate that. And then you also expect a player who we didn't talk about today, like Lewandowski, who I think that's a discussion for another day. We don't have time today to talk about Lewandowski, but he would be a player that you'd hope, for good or bad, is kind of shielding those young players from that. And you don't necessarily need Sergio Roberto behind the scenes to be that, guiding light in that way. If the proper, even the figures that aren't necessarily just players, but if there are the proper, managers, assistant managers, there are health professionals, mental health professionals, I should say, working for the club. So if all of that is in place to kind of protect these kids, you don't need the one Catalan, you know, midfielder voice that again doesn't really contribute that much on the field. And you could use his wages, or he doesn't make much, but you could use that 3.5-4 million in another spot on the wage bill. So last thing here, we don't really have time to discuss the Nike contract because when we talk about transfers, that really does dictate the next few weeks completely while talking that transfer stuff a little more. And it would make it a little more fun, to say the least, if the Nike stuff is done and, we could do those figures and figure out Barcelona's back to the 1-to-1. Now, if they're, the FFP could be changed. The wage, we don't even know what the wage bill would go up to. So what would be the due wage limit? Because again, that really boring stuff is actually the stuff that decides whether or not transfers can come in. It has a lot less to do with when we're talking about revenue and all that stuff, because that is, Barcelona being able to bring in things like that winds up helping out. So are there any names, this is a fun question for you, are there any names out there that have caught your eye when studying Flick's system? And, it could either be based in reality, which might be, again, a team that doesn't have much to spend, or it could be not based in reality. Let's say Barcelona is back to a 1-to-1 and does have some money to spend because they expect the wage bill to go way up. So, yeah, are there any, you watch a lot of their football too. Are there any names out there that have really caught your eye when thinking, hey, that player would actually be perfect under Hansi Flick here?
That's a great question. I haven't really been thinking about that sort of more broadly outside of the names that have been linked. I saw Ezekiel Palacios was from Leverkusen, I think, was sort of linked. That would be the kind of signing that would make sense to me. I'm not, again, I haven't like studied him specifically in depth, but seems to be the kind of player that, can help balance that midfield if you want to bring in somebody a bit more defensively minded. Um, but I really think the big impact signings this season have to happen in the forward areas, and bringing in a really consistent world beating winger slash inside forward kind of player would be the biggest boost to this squad. I'm not actually sure who that would be, to be honest. I'm gonna have to go away and think about that, unfortunately. But definitely a well, actually, to be fair, Kingsley Coman, I think, was vaguely linked recently, or Flick said that maybe he would like to have him or something like that. That kind of signing would be really nice. Versatile, two-footed, um, direct winger. Uh, that adds a lot of just pure quality to a front line that has sometimes lacked it in the past couple of seasons. So, yeah, very vague answer, but yeah, maybe I'll have to look into that and see if there's anybody out there that would absolutely complete this team.
Well, I do know that the concept of Mexican club and certain players, and of course, you can't speak to the Danny Alves situation it just went through, right? So it's like when you're talking about players, you kind of throw out I try to throw out certain names because I feel like I want the club to be held to a certain standard of player and professional and character that they bring in. But we also know in modern football, it's just not how it works. And so, yes, I understand why Kingsley Coman, who I'm in no way comparing his history and off the field stuff to obviously Danny Alves, who's in prison and in perpetuity. So I'm not comparing them at all, but I'm saying like the off-field stuff for Kingsley Coman in his past when he was younger. Like, I mean, again, Marcos Alonso has been in this squad, and there were not say things about him for 10 years, but he made mistakes when he was younger. And he's a professional athlete. You got to wait those things. So I don't know. I think I would have to I would have to compromise myself, as I have to do with every signing that Barcelona makes that doesn't necessarily excite me. That's why I think I'm with full voice just going Nico Williams here, because he is young. He may not be perfect, but I think if his price tag is 60 million, I think for what he provides in a 1v1 situation, his relationships off the field to not only speak Spanish, to know La Liga, but also a relationship he has with Lamine Yamal on the field of the Spanish national team. I think all of those things would allow him to really hit the ground running and handle that the pressure of Barcelona. But very much like Zubamendi, I would say, yeah, I would love to have Zubimendi and Nico Williams, but both of those players this season feel to me that they've indicated, okay, my head can be turned by Barcelona, and they may be top of my queue, but not this summer, next summer in 2025. It puts Barcelona in a difficult spot because left wing and pivot or extra midfielder are two problems they have to solve today.
Yeah. Nico Williams is a good shout as well, to be fair. And I kind of, for me, that's a signing that needs to happen. Might not happen, but like I said, that kind of winger, that kind of quality, that would transform the team. So yeah, Nico Williams for sure.
All right, Jaleel, I've taken more than enough of your time, but because we're not doing the match reviews, my audience at least, and I hope your audience has joined me for a much longer conversation here. So, I know that, again, my audience, without those 5 headlines, this I hopefully will last them the week because I still have work to do next week, the following weeks. Yes, the Hansi Flick stuff, but there's also transfer business, and I keep promising the La Masia update, which it will happen. Barca Athletic are still alive. They won the first leg at time of recording against Ibiza in Ibiza. So now they go home, and Rafa Marquez, believe it or not, is doing a really good job with Barca Athletic. His future's up in the air as well, depending on their success and whether or not they get promoted or not. And there's also, again, names for next season and who debuted at the end of this season, like Guy Fernandez, that I'm really excited about and really excited to talk about in the summer recap I always do. So that is on tap in the coming weeks. There's a bunch of work to do. I also get to take a little break here. So if you don't necessarily hear from me, there is stuff in the works. There are podcasts coming, and I'm just scheduling with guests and not having matches for the next few weeks because I think it was at about a month from now is already the first match. My goodness. So I have a few weeks just to kind of get my bearings, take a breath. Life happens. So the background might even change in the coming weeks, just to give everybody a warning on what's going on behind the scenes. So my background might change. You might say, hey, you're in a different location. The answer is likely going to be yes on that in the coming weeks. So look out for that. And in the meantime, there's a lot of thoughts and a lot of videos to watch on the Purist YouTube channel. There's a lot of history stuff that I've done. So go learn your history on my channel. Go learn your tactics on the Purist YouTube channel. And in the meantime, support the Patreon, especially not only mine, but his as well. So Jaleel does special shows on Patreon with more tactical nuance and longer conversations that he does on there. So it's a real good thing to join. So while you're on Patreon, $3 for me, as low as $3, and head over to Jill's Patreon, join his Patreon as well. And if not, just give us a subscribe on YouTube. It's the easiest thing you could do for both of us, or follow along on the podcast apps for me. Close Facebook group, Discord, those communities are still going throughout the summertime. And I said, of course, just a good rating on the podcast apps or subscribing on YouTube. Those are the best ways to help the channel, especially in the summertime when a lot of Kool-Aids have checked out because the matches are ending. It doesn't mean that Jaleel and I get to take any breaks because we still got to keep making this content because, the machine always needs to be fed, as you know. So Jaleel, I hope I did enough plugging of your stuff. So anything else to add or ready to say goodbye?
No, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you. That's more than enough. Appreciate the shout outs, and hopefully, see some of you guys over on the upcoming videos.
Yeah, so again, he's got more on the Hansi Flick series upcoming on the YouTube channel, and that's all down in the show notes or description below. Most importantly, though, thanks so much for listening to the show. Until next time, we'll talk to you soon. And Forza Barca.